Hey everybody. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to really kind of clear some things up on the different macroeconomic theories, some of the names. You read the article, but I've gotten the sense that maybe not everybody quite made it to the end of that, and could use a little brush up, just so that you can speak a little bit more eloquently to these different economic theories and how recessions get resolved and that sort of thing. So here we go. Let's begin just by talking about this idea of the mainstream view. So this is what we've always assumed, right? So in class, we have taken the mainstream view held by most economists. However, it is not a school of thought, right? So basically, what mainstream economics is what we generally do. A school of thought has like a whole series of underpinnings and theory and everything that makes sense. The mainstream view isn't really that. It's just this is what we do. Okay, so there's a little bit of this theory and a little bit of that theory and all that sort of stuff. Now there are some main ideas. So price stickiness we've obviously talked about a ton, and that is a hallmark of the mainstream view. And likewise, demand shocks. We've talked about increases and decreases in aggregate demand. We've talked about how IG is the most susceptible to shocks. We also talked a little bit about supply shocks. That's our energy prices and stuff. But in the mainstream view, this is really what causes macroeconomic instability. Price stickiness and shocks, both demand and supply. That is what makes the economy over the long run do stuff like this. Okay, so that's the mainstream view. Now, one of the very significant schools of thought that we've talked about a little bit, and you've certainly heard about it, is the monetarist view. So we all agree that instability, that there's a role of the money supply in both instability and then also in solving that instability. Okay, so the monetarists they're from the classical side. So this is not a Keynesian view. Okay, so if you kind of think about it, you've got Keynesian on one side, and then classical on the left. Right, so mainstream would certainly be here. There are others, mainstream, like we live in uh, a pretty Keynesian world where government intervention is viewed as at least a necessary evil, if not something that's actually good. Then on the classical side, you've got monetarism, you've got supply side, rational expectations theory, and then some others. But you've heard of this one. This is the big Reagan one. Monetarism we're going to talk about now. Rational expectations we'll deal with in just a second. So everybody on the classical side takes some version of this, that government interference is the problem. And if the government just didn't do anything, then things would work out better in the long run. So monetarists are known for the equation of exchange. Okay, so M is the money supply, the whole money supply. V is velocity, P is price, and Q is quantity. That shouldn't be a big surprise to anybody. Now, P times Q equals nominal GDP, right? So everything that we make times whatever we pay for it, that's nominal GDP. So what the equation of exchange tells us is that you take the velocity of money, which is how many times in a particular period, generally a year, $1 is spent and respent and respent. So when I had you guys standing at the front of the room, and a bunch of you guys were up there, and I said, all right, so business A goes to business B, and spends and spends. So since this same dollar is spent once here and once here and once again here, then you would have a velocity equaling 2. Okay, because the same dollar got spent. So if your money supply is 1 and your velocity is 2, then your GDP, your nominal GDP, will equal 2. And that's the idea. So maybe it doesn't really matter what P and Q are when we're just talking about nominal GDP. Okay? So the monetarists hold very closely to this. And an important idea here is that velocity is constant. Okay? So they believe that, and this is based on their view of data, that velocity is a constant factor. Therefore, by changing m, you can change nominal GDP in a very direct way. If m goes down, nominal GDP goes down, because if v is constant and m goes down, it has to. Likewise, if m goes up, v is constant, nominal GDP goes up, because it has to. That's just math. So they would say that monetary causes of instability come from inappropriate or bad monetary policy. Okay, so that is monetarism. It is relatively popular, and but it gets a misnomer a lot of times, because people believe that anything that has to do with M is monetarism, and that just isn't the case. We'll talk a little bit more about what makes monetarism, but the equation of exchange is a very important component of it, as is the underlying idea that velocity is constant. All right, so another idea here is a look at the real business cycle. Okay, so again, we're talking about what causes instability. Mainstreamers would say that instability is caused by price stickiness and supply and demand shocks. Monetarists would say it's bad monetary policy. And then there's this other idea on the new classical side that looks at the real business cycle view. And it basically says that shifts in long-run aggregate supply cause it. So when productivity goes down or something like that, which is the main thing, so technology or productivity changing in a way that people don't anticipate or whatever, is going to give us a leftward shift of long-run aggregate supply. Recall that we sort of assumed that negative supply, leftward shifts of aggregate supply don't really happen. But if they did, then leftward shifts of aggregate demand would also happen, because the sort of recession that gets caused by this would cause a leftward shift of aggregate demand. So the underlying idea here is, once again, does that really happen? Does a leftward shift in aggregate supply happen? Mainstream economists would say no, but real business cycle people would say yes. And they've got some data that they can point to. So another idea is the coordination failures that can happen. So if people are trying to communicate with each other and they can't, right? So, and by people, I mean everybody in the economy. Then you're going to have some, inability to coordinate well based on either limited information or expectations based on the information that you have. And we already know that expectations can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, so we can skip these for now. Let's just move on to keep things simple. But coordination failures could be another cause of macroeconomic instability, and this would be a more classical view of things. So the new classical view, basically, nobody believes purely in what Adam Smith had to say. And in light of the Great Depression and its inability, classical economics' inability to do anything about it, new classical is a new way of kind of re-examining classical economics. All right, so RET, rational expectation theory, and monetarist, they are both new classical schools of thought. So if you go back to what I had before, Keynesian here and classical here, these guys are both there. So they believe that automatic correction will occur, okay? And we'll talk about RET in a minute. Monetarist we already saw. The idea is, what's going to make the adjustment happen? Is it going to be fast or slow? Are there going to be price level changes? And then, do we anticipate any of those changes? That's going to be sort of what determines the self-correction of the economy in the new classical view, because again, there won't be government intervention. So let's look at some graphs. All right, so here at point A, we are at long-run equilibrium. Okay, now in the new classical view, if aggregate demand shifts to the right, then we will move up to point B. Okay, so we will make some more stuff, And remember that this is going to be short-lived because we are overproducing our potential GDP. And then we're also going to experience inflation. Okay, so that rightward shift causes us to move from A to B. Now, this situation, point B, is not sustainable in the long run because we're overproducing. So what's going to happen is people are going to demand higher wages. Those higher wages are then going to move us from point B to point C. Okay, so this isn't a big shock. The higher wages then are nominal. It's additional inflation. The additional inflation gives us a leftward shift of aggregate supply because those nominal wages are resource prices, and that just makes businesses produce less. So the increase in aggregate demand goes from A to B to C. Most people agree on this, and whether you're a Keynesian economist or whatever, Keynesians might say, oh, we need to raise some interest rates in order to kind of cause this leftward shift. New classical people would say, don't worry about it. Everybody's going to negotiate higher wages and it'll just take care of itself. The movement is the same. Okay. Now, how long it takes people to negotiate those higher wages and what happens is an open question. Could it be done quicker by changing interest rates and constricting monetary policy, or decreasing government spending, raising taxes, as the Keynesians would argue? The whole time it takes is the question there. All right, now. So let's look at a little more complicated situation. So we start off at A, at macroeconomic equilibrium. And now we have a leftward shift of aggregate demand, which gives us, in their view, in the new classical view, we go down to point D. But notice what happened here, okay? We went down to P4. If prices fall, then those new lower prices become we'll get back to that in a second. Those new lower prices become a rightward shift of aggregate supply. And that rightward shift of aggregate supply moves us from A. Leftward shift of aggregate demand takes us to D. The lower prices cause a rightward shift of aggregate supply, which takes us down to E. Notice the recession is resolved. We're back at potential output. Wages are lower because that's what shifted us to the right. But also output prices are lower, so our real wage, our real purchasing power, our real wage didn't actually change very much at the macro level. Okay, now there will be individual winners and losers for certain, but at the macroeconomic level, we went from A to D to E. And new classical, so this is important because FRQs will sometimes say, if you do nothing, what will happen? How will it resolve? And that would be the mechanism. Now, of course, if you have a situation of wage and price stickiness, then you go from A to F, and now you're sort of stuck. Okay, so even if you do get some downward pressure, you might wind up at D, but D isn't going to be enough because it's not. D will not cause, in the long run, after it's already taken this amount of time, it might eventually then get down to D, but you're talking like a serious lag time and a lot of pain and suffering. So that's where the time element comes in and your experience of wage and price stickiness. So back to the mainstream view, downward wage inflexibility and efficiency wage theory are the two main reasons. So we talked about this. Efficiency wage theory, it states basically, in effect, by paying people more, they are better workers. Their productivity goes up. You don't have to supervise them as much, and they stay in place, so you don't have to retrain people. So this is basically a reason for why wages are inflexible downward, because people sort of intuitively understand this. And if people are not going to work as hard, then do you really get anything by laying people off, right? Or do you get anything by cutting their wages if they're just not going to work as hard? And if you have to supervise them that much more, then you got to pay your supervisors or have more supervisors more. And if they're just going to quit and you're always, hiring new people, well, that costs you more too. We'll skip this one for now. So, in support of policy rules, so we get down to this idea of, do we want rules or do we want discretion? And then the people who do not want the government to intervene are typically proponents of rules. They want a rule that states basically, when the economy is always going to do this, that will give businesses primarily the ability to plan. Okay, and if businesses can plan, then IG, which is what we identify as being, potentially the most stable. If IG can level out, then that will help. Okay, it'll reduce this macroeconomic instability. So one of the things that people point to is a monetary rule, which basically says we're not going to change interest rates based on what we see. We're going to change interest rates in the exact same way all the time. That way everybody can plan. So if you remember when you guys were writing reports on, oh, what did the Fed do? Well, if everybody's wondering what the Fed is going to do about interest rates, it makes it difficult for them to plan. And therefore, their plan might always be ultra conservative. So they might plan, if they think that interest rates are going to rise, IG might fall. And then all of a sudden, interest rates actually don't rise. Well, now all of a sudden we have to ramp up and buy a whole bunch of stuff because interest rates are here and we think that they might go in the future. So that can give us stuff like this. Okay, a monetary rule though wouldn't work that way. We would always know what was going to happen to the money supply, and it would basically be based on inflation targeting, and it kind of requires a balanced budget. It is difficult to have these rules and to have major deficits and surpluses. You don't really want it. So the monetary rule might make sense, and it's really appealing at a theoretical level. But if it requires a balanced budget, that's a pretty dramatic shift from what the United States has been used to, and a lot of other countries as well. Not impossible, just a big shift. So let's see what that looks like. So what we want to do is, right now we know that we're at AD1, and AD1 represents a potential GDP, right? So we want, over time, our potential GDP to rise. In order for that to happen without experiencing a dramatic change in the price level, we need aggregate supply to go up. And we sort of know that both of these things are going to happen. If there's going to be greater aggregate demand, then there has to be more money, because nominal GDP, of course, is a function of P and Q, which is a function of the size of M times the velocity of money, right? So remember, MV equals PQ. So we need to manipulate M, but we don't have to manipulate it willy-nilly. We can manipulate it according to a rule. And most of the time, this is how inflation targeting would happen. So we would just say we're going to increase the money supply by 2% per year if velocity is constant, and M goes up by 2%, then PQ must go up by 2%. So we just experienced economic growth of 2%. It sounds really good, really attractive. And if it works, of course it would be. Would it work? Well, the question is open. We don't know because we've never really done it. It would cause massive change, massive tumult for a period of time. And people are sort of unwilling to take that gamble, because everybody not only has to, everybody has to believe that the rule is going to stay in effect for the long term. And, with election cycles and everything else, I think that would be a hard ask of the American economy. All right, so rules are discretion. So now on the discretionary side, so we just heard about the rule side. On the discretionary side, a lot of people would say that velocity of money isn't that stable, right? So if everything in the whole rule idea is based on V being stable and then V's not stable, then that doesn't work very well. And of course, V is relatively stable, but relatively stable might not be stable enough. Likewise, when recessions come, discretionary fiscal policy like the CARES Act can be very useful. Of course, if there's a monetary rule, then we can't just create $2 trillion in order to get ourselves out of this pandemic economically. And a lot of people would say that the CARES Act is relatively useful. You guys read about it. Most of you thought that was pretty good. And likewise, policy successes. If you look back, over the last 40 or 50 years, Certainly we've had recessions, but if you look and compare the recessions that we've had in the last 40 or 50 years, including the last two, or the one that we're in now and the previous, they actually aren't that bad compared to what we used to have. It certainly feels bad to us, but historically, if we put them into context, they're not that bad relative to what they could be based on history. So that's sort of the idea in the pro-discretionary argument. So here's a really nice chart. You should pause the video and read all of this and see what you do and do not understand. All right, now the Taylor rule, the Taylor rule we're not going to talk about. Just know that the Taylor rule is a rule. If you're interested, if you like this stuff, go ahead and go to the textbook at the end of chapter 36 and you can read about it. It is not the best rule or anything like that. It is just an example of a rule. In previous iterations of the AP test, there are periodically questions about it, but it won't make it in with the FRQ model that we have now. So give a read, but just know that like if you want an example of what a rule could be, the Taylor rule is kind of the big one that people talk about. All right, that is chapter 36. That gives you a good idea about the economy's ability to self-correct or not, rules or discretion, and then just kind of the main ideas of the two main schools of thought, the sort of Keynesian, new Keynesian school of thought, which is kind of the mainstream, represented by the mainstream, and then your new classical, which is kind of monetarism and rational expectations and that kind of thing. All right, guys, thank you very much.